Hi everyone, welcome to week 3 of American Empire, U.S. in the World. We are looking this week at the War of 1898, and I've given a quotation, which I will return to later in the lecture, from Secretary of State John Hay, A Splendid Little War. So before we get into it, I just want to say a word about the themes that I've been talking about so far, just to kind of pull some things together, because I've been sort of trying to establish some foundations for some key themes that will be with us for the rest of the module, as I said last time. So thinking about nation building and national sovereignty, thinking about economic growth, thinking about anti-Black racism, thinking about settler colonialism, and thinking about migration and exclusion are things that we will need to continue to do as the module goes ahead. We'll also need these to understand more specifically the War of 1898 that we'll be talking about this time. So I'll be doing that in 3 parts. The first, we will look at capitalism. I was talking a little bit, I sort of set the stage a little bit for this last time, thinking about overaccumulation, and I'll be saying more and in a bit more detail about that this time. So the first section, looking at Gilded Age capitalism, and what the connection is between that and this war that will be sort of the center of today's lecture. Then I'll talk about the war itself, the War of 1898. It's a war that has other names. You may have heard of this war under the term the Spanish-American War. So we'll talk about the name of this conflict, the names, the different names, and what they kind of imply, and why we might want to use one or the other. Spanish-American War is probably the most conventional way of referring to this conflict. I prefer the War of 1898. But I'll talk about that a little bit more, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit in seminar as well. Then I'll turn to another sort of set of explanations, looking at gender, race, and war in the third part of lecture. And what I want to do here is offer, in some ways, a set of alternate explanations to the economic factor that I'll be looking at in the first part of lecture, but not so much to argue that these factors are important explanatory modes instead of capitalism, but more to argue that gender and race, as well as capitalism, are necessary components for us to think about and to come to terms with in explaining this very important war. This is, all wars are important for different reasons. But this one, in terms of the theme of U.S. empire and in terms of the U.S. projection of power beyond its borders, is a really crucial one, and it is one that is referred to, ubiquitously throughout the literature on this topic. So we really need to get a sense of it. Okay, as you can see, I'm inside. I'm just getting ready to go out. It's late on a Friday afternoon here, so I thought maybe I'd go and see what was going on downtown. So I'll take a stroll down to the city center, and we'll see. It's probably very quiet, unlike what a Friday late afternoon evening should be. So I'll take a walk down there, beginning with some words on the projection of power in the age of industrial capitalism. Okay, see you outside in, well, what for you will be a split second, and for me will be a little while from now. Okay, more soon. Okay, hi everyone. Back again in, I guess, a suitably industrial looking setting as I make my way along the canal toward the city center. I probably won't need my mask. I think I can keep enough distance from other people. It's going to be quiet. I may take it off. We'll see how that goes. As you can see, it really fogs up my glasses, which makes it hard for me to read my couple of notes that I at least try to refer to a bit here. But here we are. Okay, so leading up to the War of 1898 then, with some remarks about Gilded Age industrialization. So the Gilded Age then, what does it refer to? So for our purposes, it can be, so of course for historians, one of the most important things we want to ask about an era is when does it take place? How do we periodize it? For the Gilded Age, there's a number of different ways that we can think about it. So there's someone on a bike, let me just get over. And so, of course, like any era of US history, there are debates about when we might consider it to have begun and when we might consider it to end. For our purposes, I'll use a pretty artificial, I usually use this. So first, let me just say, there's debates about this, but secondly, for our purposes, we can use a pretty simplistic periodization for the Gilded Age, and we can say it's from the end of Reconstruction in 1877, and we can run it up to the end of the 19th century. So obviously, there's no set, beginning, a day on which it felt like the Gilded Age had arrived, and a day upon which it felt like it ended. But nonetheless, within these two dates, we can see a period of a renewed wave of industrialization, and one of the biggest sort of I guess most notable dynamics of the era is the class conflict that went along with this. So we can think of the Gilded Age as an era that created tremendous wealth, and an era that created tremendous poverty, and there was no shortage of clashes between the classes in this era. So the term, I also should say, where does the name come from? What does the name even mean? Gilded meaning something, that looks flashy on the outside, like a fine metal, like gold or something, with a baser metal underneath. So something that looks good on the surface and underneath is not what it seems. So with the Gilded Age, the term is coined by Mark Twain. You can think of it as an era of, again, ostentatious displays of wealth and conspicuous consumption, and at the same time grinding poverty for many others. A bit like today in that respect. Okay, so I can't read my notes at all with this fog on my glasses. So, okay, I do want to look at my notes a little bit. I think I can keep my distance enough. I will try with the mask off for a bit and go from there, because I can't quite see. So, okay, give me a minute. Okay, that's better. There's few enough people about that I should be able to just maintain my distance and proceed this way. Okay, so as I was saying then, era of tremendous wealth, era of poverty, era of conflict, of class conflict, and that's what I'm going to be emphasizing here in the first part of lecture here. But it's not the only kind of conflict. Obviously, you have a sense of that from the earlier couple of lectures that we've had so far. So first of all, of course, again, to remind us, the end of Reconstruction led to a violent resurgence of white supremacy, which I talked about before. So obviously, racial conflict is something that runs through the Gilded Age as it continued to define a very, very fundamental and important dynamic within U.S. society before the Gilded Age, during the Gilded Age, and after the Gilded Age. Women, who are still decades away from the vote at this point, were paid less than men and lived under the strictures of an idealized kind of femininity of this period. So gender inequality and gender oppression and gender conflict, we may even say, defines the Gilded Age as well. And workers, many of them new immigrants, worked for in very difficult conditions. They adjusted themselves to the new industrial realities of the era. And it's this labor and owners, this conflict between labor, workers and owners, that I want to particularly emphasize in the first part of lecture here. And to look at, again, the development of U.S. capitalism in the Gilded Age, and the connection then between that and the U.S. projection of power through the War of 1898. Okay, so this new economy that took shape in the period of the Gilded Age, it's sometimes called corporate capitalism, organized capitalism, monopoly capitalism. There's a few different terms for it. Whatever we call it, we have to come to terms with its impact on the United States within its borders, and as the U.S. and as its impact on the U.S. as a rising international power. So the trend toward big business was the result of several forces in this moment. Markets of increased size made larger sums available for the development of expensive new technologies. This is also an era of great technological change. Again, like our own, but in some ways, maybe the technological changes of the Gilded Age were more profound than the technological changes of our own era. The difference between, the presence of a telegraph or the absence of it is pretty significant, as well as some of the other changes in communications technology and transportation technology that took place at this time. So businesses got bigger in this era, and very large businesses came to dominate certain sectors of the economy as well, through processes such as vertical or horizontal integration. So businesses that might take over all of the different, buy up all of the different aspects of a supply chain and the retail distribution chain, or other businesses which might try to take over kind of at a more of a lateral level the other businesses within their sort of place in the chain from resources to finished manufactured goods. So all the mines, for example, or all the factories, or all the railroads, etc. Okay, so urban life is also really key in this era, in that urban life comes to eclipse rural life in the United States in this era. So the United States becomes more of an urban country as well as a more industrial one, the two very much going together. And this is also connected to the sort of tendency toward monopoly of businesses, in that in the countryside, farmers, small farmers, were being pushed or I guess encouraged in different ways to move to leave the agricultural sector and move into the cities, as bigger businesses with more financial power were taking over the agricultural sector as well. Okay, so but urban living, can be more. How perfect, right, in the center of a major city that was so important in the Industrial Revolution, in England, and of course continued to be so in the era that I'm talking about for the U.S. as well. So urban life could be exciting, but it also wasn't necessarily the easy life, given the impact of the economic boom and bust cycle. So this is another part, of course, I think you know this, capitalism's sort of tendency to move in secular patterns from, more prosperous times and more devastating times. And so it's not only the case that that businesses are able to generate more wealth and conditions are difficult for workers, and especially for the unemployed, but also that at different times in that cycle, obviously, the situation can be more extreme at either end. So it's not always the same in a given year throughout the Gilded Age as well. And I mentioned this before about the panics, or what we might call now depressions, that took place periodically throughout this era as well. So this conflict then between workers and owners over, wages, over conditions of working conditions, the things that, of course, that never go away when you have, private ownership, workers who work for bosses. There's conflict between the two around who's going to get what, how extreme the exploitation is going to be, etc. So this is very much the question of the day in the Gilded Age. And this also happens through everyday kinds of conflict between managers and workers. Workers who might, try to slow down the pace of production, who might try to keep the workers' brain under the workers' hat in terms of having autonomy and control over their working conditions. And of course, it's the job of managers to wrest that control away from those doing the work, and and be able to therefore more effectively control the workforce. So this is ongoing, and it happens again in an everyday way. It also happens at a more sort of spectacular level in a series of great strikes that happen throughout the Gilded Age. So this is another way in which the Gilded Age is remembered and thought of as an era of industrial conflict. These strikes that happen are a big example of this. So in 1877, for instance, there's a huge strike of railway workers across the country. And this involves not only workers going out on strike, setting up picket lines and this kind of thing, but also then employers bringing in strike breakers, and there being direct violence at sites of workplaces near railroad yards in this case, and so on. The other key thing to remember is that the state has a role to play in all of this, and during the Gilded Age, the state very much sides with owners against workers to try to break strikes, to break the power of unions, to ensure that the profits of big business are able to accumulate and to keep accumulating. Just noticing it's quite nice here. I'll let you have a quick look around here. You know, of course, where I am here at the library. But it's quite a nice time of the evening, late afternoon, as it were. What time is it? 4:45 on a Friday evening here. So there's a few people around, but it's quiet, that's for sure. If we weren't in lockdown, I'm sure there'd be a lot more people milling around and enjoying. It's a little cold, but it's not bad. Enjoying the plaza here. Okay, so continuing on then, so strikes then remain one of the indicators of this. So one of the other issues that sort of faces capitalism is not just that of workers versus owners in terms of, manager-worker day-to-day conflict, large-scale strikes which happen, and the railroad strike of 1877 is far from the only one. There are numerous throughout the period. But another kind of more structural problem that capitalism faces is, again, this problem of overaccumulation. So I put a couple of points on the slide up about this, and I explained this a little bit before. So technological innovation and economies of scale enable, as I said before, greater production. And so this creates the ability to make more goods. But of course, the other side of supply is demand, and you have to have people able to purchase the goods. Otherwise, there'll be a glut in the market, and this is what happens. This intensified focus on production during the Gilded Age leads to gluts in the market and helps to create the conditions for full panics or depressions to take place. So the result then is an overabundance of products, falling prices, decreasing wages, unemployment, and then more social unrest, right? These strikes were something that people were paying a lot of attention to and talking about, and they continue to sort of dramatize this conflict, which is partly caused by structural issues in the economy as well, namely overaccumulation. Okay, so what to do then? If there's this problem, then owners in particular, who have tremendous power, especially the owners of big business in this era, the robber barons, as they were often called, need to try to solve this problem, and they certainly work on it. So one way out of this is to further lower wages, and of course, this is something that is of interest to many employers, but wages are already very low, so it's difficult to push them below a subsistence level on the one hand, and on the other hand, this also is not going to help the consumption side of things, because workers who paid even less are going to be even less likely to consume and pay for the products of industry. They could invest in advertising. This is an important answer to the problem. To convince consumers that they not only should desire or might desire, but perhaps need, for a variety of reasons, products being sold. And we are so surrounded by advertising everywhere that it's kind of hard to picture this even being much of a new concept. But nonetheless, it was, and it actually isn't the main, and there are examples of this. I put up a few slides, Coca-Cola and so on. Some companies do engage in advertising, and a bit of a kind of, advertising industry begins to build, but it's still early days. It's really only after World War I when the kind of state power of propaganda really shows just how powerful kind of media can be of different kinds to convince people of different things in the World War I context, more around questions obviously of patriotism, enlistment, and so on. But it's really only after that point that the kind of Madison Avenue phenomenon really comes into its own, and the 20s is more an era of major advertising, which looks a little bit more like what we have today. So this is a solution. Some businesses take it up, but it's not a major solution to overaccumulation for the industrialists of the era, the Andrew Carnegies and the Jay Goulds and so on. So another solution is the arrival of massive numbers of immigrants from Europe into the United States at this time. Famously coming through past the Statue of Liberty and coming through Ellis Island in New York. So these immigrants are also workers, and they provide, a kind of steady stream of incoming cheap labor for industry as well. But again, this sort of connects to the strategy of cutting wages, and that doesn't always work either. It doesn't solve the structural problem, even if it's sort of attractive to individual businesses. Okay, so you might see where this is going. And you might think back to Charles Conant, who I mentioned in my first lecture, as well as Cecil Rhodes in the British context. So one of the key Gilded Age solutions that is talked about and put forward is that of expansion, physical expansion of the economy, imperialism, in other words. Hi, not at the moment. Setting up, thank you. Setting up perhaps colonies, or at the very least, taking over other areas and expanding the economy that way, gaining also at the same time access to resources and to cheap resources. So by the 1890s then, there's a lot of talk about this in business circles. Conant and Rhodes on either side of the Atlantic are not unusual in this respect. And so it's no coincidence then that the 1890s saw the end of continental U.S. expansion, again, the kind of process of settler colonialism that I've talked about, crises in the relationship between labor and capital, as well as problems in the overall economy, and in this era, very much renewed attention to U.S. foreign relations. So, and this idea of potential economic expansion. So this evolving and expanding economy then gave the government of the United States reason to pay much more attention to conditions overseas. So this doesn't directly in a mechanical way cause a war to happen, but it is a very important context for thinking about the reasons for the U.S. to begin to look, to give greater focus to issues overseas, and to begin to think about engaging in international relations as more of an overtly imperialist power. Okay, let me take a break for a second, and then we will turn to part two, leading up to the war itself. Okay, back again. And let me just say before I continue, I just love this part of town. I don't know. It's not quite the jewelry quarter. I guess it's still just the city center. But the buildings are just amazing. I mean, Birmingham has so many lovely buildings. I don't know much about architecture, but I like the look of the buildings in this area. So I'm at the corner of Margaret Street and Cornwall Street. Okay, I think I'll take Cornwall. This is a lovely street, actually. Here, let me just put the camera down there. Okay, and let me get back to the topic at hand. Okay, so all of this economic background that I mentioned has, you know, this is the background. This is key. This is very important to understand. Again, it's not mechanical causation, but it also, it wouldn't make sense for us to say that the economy, you know, in a direct way causes the war to happen, but it would equally not make sense for us to not look at the economy being such an important factor in this era as well. So it has a role, and the kind of causality that is present here is something for us to debate and discuss and to consider together. Okay, but it definitely forms something around the decision ultimately of the administration of the U.S. President William McKinley to go to war against Spain and against various independent anti-colonial movements in the year of 1898. So McKinley was an Ohio politician, and he was a spokesperson for protectionism in foreign trade, and his chance at the presidency came after the economic collapse of 1893, again, another one of these panics or depressions, and it was after this point that voters sort of turned away from the Democrats and created the conditions for a Republican administration to come in again. So this was significant, but also really significant to McKinley's success as a president was the role of one of his key advisors, Mark Hanna. So Mark Hanna was also an industrialist, big business person, again, not surprising at that time. And so, as it wouldn't be surprising at other times too, this is not only the Gilded Age where big business has a major hand in terms of influencing politics, but particularly not surprising here. Okay, so Mark Hanna is also an Ohio industrialist, and he's an important advisor in terms of really kind of modernizing the idea of the presidency and modernizing the idea of how to run presidential campaigns as well. Not just sort of the occasional speech, but actually, you know, putting real money into a campaign, organizing tours, putting out PR, etc. So this also helps McKinley to come into office in what would this have been, the election of 1896. So, okay, so he comes into office, and so crucially here, events in Cuba really, in particular, I think at first, are kind of the most important to this story. So, what's going on in Cuba? It's a Spanish colony. Spain is, you know, still an imperial power at this point. It, of course, was much mightier in earlier centuries. By the end of the 19th century, Spanish power in the Americas has quite waned. Most of Spain's colonies became independent in the around 1820. Mexico, you know, throughout South America, many parts of the Spanish Empire are no longer. But there still are a few important Spanish colonies in the 1890s, and Cuba is one of them. Within Cuba, there's also an important independence movement that is struggling for to free the country of Cuban rule and to become independent, just like many of the other Latin American countries had at that time. So this is going on while McKinley is the president, and so Spain, you know, did promise to bring in some more autonomy for Cubans under the conditions of the Spanish Empire. Again, a kind of typical, you know, imperial move. Grant more autonomy in order to retain ultimate control. And also Spain abolishes slavery in 1886. So one of the very last. Brazil, I think, is the last one. but this is very late in terms of the formal abolition of slavery. But a campaign for full independence continues nonetheless. These measures on the part of the Spanish government do not placate the independence forces led by Jose Marti, probably most famously, but also Maximo Gomez and Antonio Maceo Grajales. There are several important leaders of this independence movement in Cuba to make Cuba independent of Spain. So Jose Marti is actually killed in 1895 during the independence struggle, which happens in sort of different waves. It's not happening anew in the 1890s, but it's happening with new kind of intensity. So the Spanish are fighting against these independence forces, trying to hold on to the colony, and they use increasingly brutal measures to retain control. The Spanish general, Valeriano Weyler, roughly pushed the peasantry into these camps, and this is one of the first examples of concentration camps in world history happens at this time. It's not the only places. Also the Boer War, other places right around the same time, this phenomenon is coming into existence as a technique of pacifying populations and a technique of warfare, but it's happening here. And so the United States is watching this with interest, partly because the U.S. has business interests there too, and so they're paying close attention. Ultimately, the U.S. sends one of its ships down there. This is now in 1898, early in the year. The USS Maine sails down to Havana Harbor, and as you may know, it did not meet a pleasant fate there. It's sunk. The boat is sunk in the harbor. And so it's not clear who did it. I don't think it's been definitively proven who exactly was behind the sinking of the Maine, even to this day. Good dissertation topic, I imagine, for those who have looked into it, or who might want to look into it. Nonetheless, its significance for our purposes is that it renews, obviously, U.S. attention on Spain. It also becomes a rallying cry for war against the Spanish in Cuba itself. The rallying cry, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," is popular at the time. So just to give you an example. So the business community is not necessarily united around the idea of war, and even McKinley himself at first. You have to remember too that politicians of McKinley's age can very much remember the carnage and brutality of the U.S. Civil War, and so it's not a given that they're going to be in a rush to join in a renewed conflict of warfare. So the business community is not necessarily united, but important elements do wish to see war take place between Spain on the island of between Spain and the United States on the island of Cuba. Okay, so ultimately, let me just get this. Yeah, so really it's the aftermath of the Maine that kind of changes the public mood and pushes McKinley more to favor war against Spain, which he ultimately does declare. And then, much of the population and the business community swing behind McKinley as well here. And the war is then an open conflict between the United States and Spain. So this is, one of the reasons why, of course, kind of obviously, it's called the Spanish-American War. And I'll pause here for a second to say a little bit more about that kind of differences of names. So clearly, as you also can tell, it's not only Spanish and U.S. actors that are interested parties here. Of course, very central are obviously Cubans who have been fighting for independence. So to call this the I'm going to go by the cathedral here. It looks very nice. I'll show you. And I'll walk over here so I can keep my distance from everyone. Okay, so what was I saying? Oh yeah, obviously, this is a Cuban war as well. So to call it the Spanish-American War kind of erases the participation of Cubans, as well as other, key forces wanting independence in this era in other theaters of this war, in places like Puerto Rico and the Philippines as well. So War of 1898 is a way of sort of, it's a more general term that can include more of the participants than necessarily Spanish-American War, which seems to sort of erase as much as it reveals. Okay, so McKinley, in any case, is now engaged in war against Spain. He sends the U.S. Navy ships to the Spanish colony of the Philippines to fight there. They are victorious in both the Pacific, I guess, and Caribbean theaters of this international conflict. And so, and the Spanish forces have already been fighting against the Cubans. There also is an important independence movement in the Philippines as well. So this arrival of fresh troops from the U.S., which particularly in the Cuban example is much closer to the U.S. than it is to Spain, also really tips the balance of forces. And Spain, whose own government is, in two minds about how hard they want to fight to keep these colonies in the first place, really helps to decide the conflict in favor of the United States. Okay. So it takes about 4 months for the U.S. to emerge victorious on the Cuban island. An important also politician who's involved in this is Theodore Roosevelt. He leads the so-called Rough Riders who fight at the San Juan Hill against Cuban forces as well. So he goes on, of course, Theodore Roosevelt, all the more important because he goes on to become president also. So he's another figure who is involved in this fighting as well. Okay, so the war comes to an end, and the Treaty of Paris is the one that brings an official conclusion to this on December 10th of 1898. So you've got the Maine arriving in January and the Treaty of Paris in December. So from end to end, the sort of event that really in particular leads up to the war, and the official conclusion of the war itself all happens within the 1 year. Okay, so in the Philippines, meanwhile, the independence forces in the Philippines, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, they take this as an opportunity for independence, not to become subjugated to the United States. This is also true of Cuba. And so what happens in the Philippines in particular is that the United States is able, primarily through a naval victory, to defeat the Spanish Empire in its colony there. But the U.S. is then immediately engaged in a war against the independence forces in the Philippines, who were fighting against Spain and go on, to fight against U.S. forces after that. Let's see here. So this presents also McKinley's administration with kind of with a not quite a dilemma, but definitely a decision whether or not to act as a formal imperial power and to take on the Philippines as a colony. And so McKinley sort of is thinking over this, and here was his explanation, speaking here to a group of ministers about his decision to think about formal colonization in this case. And this is a really key moment, of course, for the topic of U.S. empire, the ideas behind the U.S. becoming a formal imperial power. So McKinley says, quote, "I walked the floor of the White House night after night until midnight. And I am not ashamed to tell you, gentlemen, that I went down on my knees and prayed Almighty God for light and guidance more than one night. and one night late it came to me this way. I don't know how it was, but it came. 1. That we would not give them back to Spain. That would be cowardly, and dishonorable. 2. That we could not turn them over to France and Germany, our commercial rivals in the Orient. Notice business interests playing in his mind here. That would be bad business, again, and discreditable. 3. That we could not leave them to themselves. They were unfit for self-government. They would soon have anarchy and misrule over there, worse than Spain's was. And 4. That there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very best we could by them as our fellow men for whom Christ also died. McKinley goes on, and then I went to bed and went to sleep and slept soundly, and the next morning I sent for the chief engineer of the War Department and told him to put the Philippines on the map of the United States, and there they are, and there they will stay while I am president. So, there are many things to say here, and you can see that business is part of his thinking, but it's certainly not the only part. Religion playing a role here. The Spanish, of course, had put considerable energy into Christianizing the Filipinos, but of course it was the wrong kind of Christianity in that this would have been Catholicism rather than the Protestantism preferred by McKinley. Obviously, of course, race is playing a huge role in McKinley's thinking about who is, sort of axiomatically fit for self-government and who is not, in his thinking as well. So within the United States, the war also has an important plays an important role in ongoing kind of discussions within U.S. society about colonialism and the suitability of colonialism as a kind of power for the United States to engage in. And we can see here, if we think about how the War of 1898 impacts the United States within its borders, this also is an example of an important point. So first of all, the impact being, in particular, the debate about this, about whether this is a suitable mode of conducting oneself in the international arena. So it also dramatizes, though, a kind of larger point, which is that U.S. relations in the wider world, we often think about in terms of the impact of the U.S. on other places, and of course we very much have an example of that here, with the U.S. seizing control of Cuba, of the Philippines, of Puerto Rico at the same time, of the island of Guam as well. So we can see all of this happening, and obviously this has a big impact on these places. But it's also important to remember that the very process of this wider world engagement sort of makes and remakes the United States within its borders as well. So whether the United States, in terms of the public discourse, whether intellectuals and politicians are going to think of the U.S. as an imperial power is a major debate of the day.
To arrive on platform 1 is the library for Centenary Square, Birmingham.
So I'm at New Street Station, obviously.
Please stand clear of the doors and allow passengers to get off before boarding the cab.
Okay, so in any case, the U.S. does take formal colonial control over the Philippines, and does take a kind of informal control over Cuba. Cuba formally is able to become independent, but the U.S. troops only leave with the proviso going into the, well, it's not really a proviso, it's an amendment going into the Cuban Constitution, the Platt Amendment, which gives the U.S. control over the Cuban economy and also over Cuban foreign policy. So Cuba does become independent, but obviously economy and foreign policy are pretty important, and so it becomes independent with a very compromised kind of independence, kind of sovereignty. And in this, we can also see sort of two different modes of imperialism at work. One, in the Philippines, more overtly, more in the British style, establishing an actual colony, and the Philippines remains a colony of the United States until 1946, formally. then in the Cuban example, we can see a kind of informal, we might also see this as imperial kinds of relations of US business continuing to have important sway over the island. This remains, of course, a major issue leading up to and then after. Of course, we'll talk about this more when we get to 1959 later in the module. But this is another kind of mode of imperialism without necessarily setting up colonies that we can see happening here as well. Okay, so let me conclude this section by coming back to John Hay, who gave us the quotation that I used for the title of this lecture. So, but let me just cross the street first before I do that. Okay. Very quiet down here compared to how it would normally be. Actually, we're going to walk by a pub and restaurant that I quite like. It'd be sad to see it closed, which of course it will. Cherry Reds. I don't know if you've ever been there. It's nice. So it's remains strange. It remains so hard to get used to these pandemic times. Okay, let me continue. So so this newfound stature then of the United States as now a formally foreign power led. One of the things that it led to was, or one of the things I guess it provides the context for, is this idea of the open door notes. This is really important, which are proclaimed by John Hay. So Hay was actually the ambassador to the UK when the War of 1898 took place, and he captured some of the spirit among ruling circles as the fighting got underway. Again, calling it a splendid little war. He went on to say, begun with the highest motives, carried on with magnificent intelligence and spirit, and favored by that fortune which loves the brave. So really patriotic and romanticized sort of idea of warfare here from Hay. So he's appointed the Secretary of State, though, in time to negotiate. He was there for the negotiations with Spain that conclude the conflict with the Treaty of Paris. And as a result of this victory, the United States was now a serious Pacific power, of course, too, with its colony in the Philippines. And this also was significant for the relations between the United States and China. Again, the China market always having captured the imagination of many U.S. businessmen. There's Cherry Reds. I will come back and have a pint again when I can. Okay, so the situation in China, the dynastic government there, the Qing dynasty was in very serious decline. The Opium War, going back to the first one in the 1840s, was another example of this. So there had been a kind of decline of dynastic power in China for some time at this point. So with the U.S. having now a presence in the Philippines, much closer to China and the potential China market, this creates the context for Hay's proposal of the open door notes. So of course the United States is not the only power interested in China and interested in gaining more control there. Britain and France, Germany has the Shandong colony. Germany has a presence here as well. Japan, obviously. And so what Hay proposes is that no government will be able to formally colonize China, and instead it will be an open door. So all of the different imperial powers, including the United States, can do business and can kind of hold sway. It could be a sort of a mutual sphere of influence for all of the imperial powers. This is a pretty bold move on the part of Hay because the United States is growing in power, but it's still not considered necessarily, particularly in European circles, to be one of the sort of first and foremost powers. So for a, in some ways, sort of upstart power to suggest, okay, everybody, I have a plan for all of us that we should follow, it's kind of a bold move. It makes sense in the kind of the ways that 1898 announced the U.S. as a fairly formidable imperial power. The powers do decide to go along with this. They were evasive at first, but they do come around to the idea And so there is a kind of agreement in principle on this by 1900. So the open door notes then took the substance of the debate of the imperialists took the substance kind of out of the debate between the imperialists and anti-imperialists within the U.S. And that it now became possible to project imperial ambitions without acquiring formal colonies. And Cuba is obviously a kind of lead up to this, but we see it even more so in the Chinese example. So in this sense then, the War of 1898 and the open door notes establish a template for US foreign policy in the 20th and 21st centuries, again through this informal kind of model. Okay, let me take one more break here, and then we'll come back to talk about how gender and race figure into this situation more directly. Okay, back again. So in the first couple parts of lecture, I was emphasizing the kind of economic backdrop, the problems of overaccumulation, and in some ways kind of profit motive in terms of an overall system for the expansion of the economy and for something like the expansion of power that the War of 1898 represented. I then looked at the war itself with some reference to the business kind of motivation for this, and a little bit of reference to race, but I want to focus on this a little bit more for the concluding section of lecture here. Because figures like McKinley and Mark Hanna, just like leaders today, they existed in a cultural context. They're not sort of just simply rational decision makers who are seeing the interests of business with which they represent and are aligned with, and acting directly in accordance with it. But of course they are carrying out their policies, as you saw with that longer quotation I read from McKinley, in a cultural context and with a set of racial and gendered and religious assumptions that go along with that. So in the late 19th century, the association then, to speak first a little bit about gender, and of course, we separate these out analytically, race, class, and gender, but obviously they are entangled with one another, and each one is only sort of makes sense in relation to the others. But for analytical purposes, as I did with business and capitalism, let me say a little bit about gender here before saying a little bit more about race. So in the late 19th century, the association of manhood and political power was a central part of the culture that McKinley and others were a part of. The political pressure to assume a manly posture and to espouse manly policies gave gender beliefs the power to affect decision making. So the Thejingos, as they were called, the kind of very strongly patriotic pro-war forces, they had a number of reasons, why they might want to be pro-war. Economics, reasons of political ambition. You can make a career out of being a pro-war politician sometimes. For reasons of strategy, out of sympathy perhaps with the independence forces, particularly in Cuba, because that story was really in the news in the lead up to the war. And these sort of possible motivations were also sort of worked through a gendered kind of thinking and a gendered kind of discourse. So the manhood issue was connected to a variety of other arguments for war. For example, an expanded market and colonial holdings were seen as a way to sort of prevent men from falling into idleness and from becoming insufficiently masculine. So even something like the economic sort of argument that I've mentioned is itself connected to ideas of manhood and ideas of sort of appropriate gender roles. So the links between manhood, military service, and political authority led some leaders to think that their political careers, again, would be enhanced by a militarist sort of course. So another key thing to remember, I said before that the politicians of McKinley and Hanna's generation could remember the U.S. Civil War all too well. Well, also veterans more generally played a huge role in kind of public life in the U.S. after the U.S. Civil War. And so these military figures, of course, veterans, were heralded and praised in public life over and over again. And this sentiment had real sort of resonance again for ideas of manhood during the Gilded Age, because these kind of revered figures were soldiers, and they also were men sort of exemplifying a particular kind of masculinity that connected manhood with military service. So notions of military manlyhood also influenced policymakers as the Cuban campaign was not just getting underway, but in the lead up to it. Many representations of Cuba as a feminine figure in need of rescue from a masculine Uncle Sam pervaded the discourse in terms of how the anti-colonial conflict, I'm going to cross the street here, was represented in the U.S. press. So gender also mattered in terms of the representations of what was going on in Cuba as well. It also played into the kind of debate about whether or not to go into the war, because within the United States, opponents of imperialism were represented as feminine, right? Not just as having, not being patriotic enough, or not having the kind of sensible sort of ideas in terms of promoting the economy into an expanded sphere, but specifically a gender discourse came to characterize opponents of empire as well. So gender, again, was interconnected with race, and it doesn't, racial depictions were also, as you can see on the slides that I put up, were also central to all of this. And they're also gendered racial images. So they're also gendered racial images that connect to the kind of business case for the war. So once again, we'll need to think about these in intersectional terms, and we'll need to think about them at the same time. Okay, so those who fought for Filipino independence, again, you can see some of this in the slides, were routinely infantilized. So there's also a kind of sort of, not quite generational, but sort of, adults versus kids almost, not almost, direct representation that's going on in some of these images as well. So this sort of racialized idea of white policymakers, white people in general as adults, and people of color as children was a kind of another sort of form of the racist ideology that was playing through the way that the conflict was represented, the way that the conflicts in these different places in terms of anti-colonial and colonial forces were playing out as well. So also this is also playing out in, of course, the context of the aftermath of Reconstruction, and the kinds of white supremacist theories that justified Reconstruction's overthrow were, of course, readily available and easily deployable for this overseas conflict as well. So these ideas, these notions of white superiority also, they operated sometimes perhaps consciously as sort of discourses to be mobilized, and at other times, I'm sure, unconsciously in terms of a set of racial assumptions on the part of whites within the United States, shared by others. Cecil Rhodes, for example, again in the British Empire, about a kind of racial suitability to rule at the same time. So in another example of the connections between domestic and international racial continuities, settler colonialism also has a kind of a role to play here. Not because Cuba or the Philippines or Puerto Rico or Guam were to be set up as settler colonies, but because the same kind of logic of racial rule that went along with settler colonialism also was at work here. And sometimes, you know, Theodore Roosevelt was one who proclaimed that letting the Philippines, you know, for the Philippines to be independent would be like Native Americans having sovereignty within their own territories within the United States. Again, which was just an axiom in his mind that this would have been unsuitable as a mode of governance. It's also the case that even more directly than just in terms of ideology, many of the officers in the against the forces in the Philippines, the independence forces, were themselves veterans of wars against Native Americans. So there's also a direct continuity of settler colonialism and kind of U.S. imperialism at the same time. And then, of course, also there's Hawaii, lying, you know, in between the settler nation of the U.S. and the Philippines. So, as I mentioned before, a planters' coup established, sort of formally established white rule on the Hawaiian Islands with the deposing of the Queen, Liliuokalani, and that's in 1893. And in 1898, McKinley sort of takes the opportunity to sort of formally make Hawaii a U.S. territory at this time. And so, you know, important for strategic reasons as well, to be able to have a naval station at a place like Pearl Harbor is already a kind of consideration that is entering the more, if not global, but certainly fully Pacific reach of U.S. power at this time. So, also for African Americans, the War of 1898 raises a number of questions. An opportunity to participate in patriotism, but also obviously there's a debate, you know, not least because of the kind of racist implications of the war itself. The case of David Fagan is not representative, but nonetheless, just sort of, if nothing else, very interesting and certainly significant to think about. So Fagan was an African American soldier in the Philippines who joined the Filipino forces, the independence forces fighting then against the United States, and the U.S. Army in the Philippines. They, you know, capturing Aguinaldo was priority number one. Capturing David Fagan was priority number two. He was caught and killed ultimately, and his body turned over to the U.S. There was a local force who I believe are the ones who killed him. But this idea that a kind of racial solidarity of people of color against the white supremacist sort of project that was the U.S. conquest of the Philippines, you know, it's not surprising that the U.S. military took this so seriously and wanted to neutralize that threat so urgently. Okay, so from representation then to sort of direct elements within the theater of warfare itself, we can see race playing out in a lot of different ways. It also, you know, it also has a role in in the evolving forms of white identity at this time also. So, you know, I mentioned again that the British Empire matters very much in the story that I'm telling, as one of the other key imperial powers, and also as the imperial power that is, you know, often engaging with the United States in different ways, as rival, as ally, later as in special relationship. As the United States sort of achieves a kind of, you know, of course the United States becomes formally independent back in 1776/1783, but kind of, you know, a full sovereignty takes longer for the United States to be as powerful as it is vis-a-vis Britain. So So this is part of the story here as well. And let me finish then by saying a word about that, because Cecil Rhodes, the literary figure from over here, Rudyard Kipling, the literary figure from over here, is writes his poem, "The White Man's Burden," at this time. And it's maybe not the most well-known aspect of it is that it is written on the occasion of the United States in its war against Spain and in its acquisition of the Philippines as a colony. So in some ways we can see The White Man's Burden as a kind of imperialist poem, sometimes read as a satire, but not necessarily. We can talk about that, how we might read it. But as a sort of welcoming to the club in some ways of the United States, but not only to a club of whiteness, but also a specific Anglo-Saxonism here as well. So this is also an era in the United States in which whiteness is itself undergoing certain kinds of transformations around whether white Anglo-Saxons within a larger kind of thinking about whiteness are the most suitable to be in charge and at the top of the pile, or whether whiteness is a larger kind of racial category that includes immigrants from other European locations as well. Okay, so in the end, let me sit here for a second and just get a little bit from my notes here. So conquering the Philippines cost $600 million, and it took the lives of 4,200 US soldiers. The total Filipino casualty rate is generally agreed to be approximately 220,000, or roughly double the number of casualties that the United States would suffer in World War I. So again, this is, Americans die in this conflict, but a tremendous number of Filipinos do, as well, as this fighting goes on for several years into the early 20th century, as the U.S. establishes kind of full control and consolidates its rule. So the Philippines was granted partial autonomy in the 1930s, but it's not until 1946 that the Philippines becomes formally independent. In Cuba, nationalists chafed under the limitations of the Platt Amendment until the Cuban Revolution of 1959, which of course we'll talk about later. In 1917, Puerto Ricans were granted U.S. citizenship, but literacy and property requirements barred the majority from voting, and the island remained home to an ongoing independence movement, even if it wasn't necessarily in the majority. So the United States then entered the 20th century by announcing that it was now a world power. This announcement did not mean that the great powers of Europe agreed that the U.S. was now their equal, but compared to the status of the United States in the international community just a century before, the global balance of forces had changed tremendously. Okay, so with that, I leave you until next time. Okay, I'm heading home. Bye.